Let's go back in time to the winter of 1959. We're deep in the Soviet Union, in the Ural Mountains. It's a place that's remote, unforgiving, and brutally cold. And it's here that a story began to unfold. Not just a tragedy, but one of the most baffling and enduring mysteries of the entire 20th century. The hikers at the center of this story made their very last camp on the slopes of a mountain. Now, the local Mansi people, they have a name for this place, Kholit Syakhl. And that name is chilling. In their native tongue, it means Mountain of the Dead, a name that would turn out to be terrifyingly accurate. And this is so important to remember. We're talking about 9 incredibly skilled hikers. These were not novices. They were all experienced in this exact kind of extreme environment. But something happened to them on that mountain. Something so bizarre and so horrifying that, even now, it defies any easy explanation.
To really understand the mystery, you first have to understand the expedition itself. This was no simple camping trip. This was a seriously ambitious trek, one that was designed to test the limits of even the most seasoned mountaineers.
The group was made up of 9 people. Most of them were students at the Ural Polytechnical Institute. Their leader was a 23-year-old named Igor Dyatlov, who was a really experienced and well-respected outdoorsman. These were serious people, and this was a very serious challenge. And their goal was just as serious. They were going for a Grade 3 certification. Now, that was the highest possible rating for a ski trek in the Soviet Union at the time. And this detail is absolutely crucial because it tells you just how competent they were. They were prepared, they knew exactly what they were doing, they weren't the kind of people who would panic for no reason. If you look at their timeline, you can see they were making good, steady progress. They set off in late January. Early on, one member, Yuri Yudin, had to turn back because he got sick, a decision that, almost certainly saved his life. The other 9 pushed on, and on January 31st, they reached the slopes of the Mountain of the Dead. On February 1st, they set up what would become their final camp. And then, sometime in the deep, frozen quiet of that night, in the early hours of February 2nd, the unthinkable happened. Their expedition completely unraveled, turning into a desperate, chaotic fight for their lives. The very first clues that were found later were just deeply strange. You see, the tent wasn't torn open from the outside, like by an animal. It was sliced open from the inside. Something terrified them so much that they couldn't even take a few seconds to untie the entrance. They just cut their way out and ran into the brutal sub-zero cold, leaving everything behind, their boots, their warm coats, all of their critical supplies. When the group didn't send a telegram by their scheduled return date, people started to worry, and a search and rescue team was sent out. But what that search party eventually found would only make the mystery even deeper. It took a while, but finally, on February 26th, the searchers found it, the abandoned, half-buried tent. Inside, all their belongings were there, pretty much in order, but the hikers themselves were gone. All they found were footprints in the snow, leading away from the camp and down the slope. Finding the hikers happened in stages, and it took months. The first 2 bodies were discovered under a huge cedar tree, over a kilometer away from the tent. Then they found 3 more, in the space between that tree and the camp, almost as if they were trying to crawl back. But it took another 2 full months for the spring thaw to melt the snow, before they found the last 4, buried deep in a nearby ravine. And this is where we get to the real heart of the mystery, the evidence from the autopsies. Because once the medical examiners started their work, the story just went from tragic to completely contradictory and disturbing. What they found was a huge contradiction. For 6 of the hikers, the cause of death was hypothermia. They froze to death. And, that makes sense, right? They ran out into the Arctic cold without proper gear. But the other 3, the ones they found last in the ravine, they died from something totally different. Massive catastrophic internal injuries, like crushed chests and fractured skulls. And just to give you some perspective on that, the force needed to cause those kinds of injuries was enormous. The lead investigator at the time actually said it was similar to the impact from a high-speed car crash. But here's the truly baffling part. On the outside, their bodies had almost no wounds, no major cuts, no big bruises. It was like they'd been squeezed by some kind of incredible, invisible force. And the strange details just kept piling up. One of the women in the ravine was missing her tongue and her eyes. Some of their clothes had trace amounts of radioactivity on them, and another weird thing, the 4 hikers who had those awful traumatic injuries were actually dressed better than the others, as if they had maybe taken clothes from their friends who had already died. So, faced with all this contradictory, bizarre evidence, what did the Soviet authorities do? They closed the investigation just a few months later, in May of 1959. Their official conclusion was that the hikers died from a compelling natural force. I mean, that phrasing is so vague, isn't it? It basically closes the book without admitting what they didn't know, or maybe what they didn't want to say. And then they sealed off the entire area for 3 years. An answer like that doesn't really answer anything, does it? It just creates more questions. That lack of a clear explanation, combined with all the secrecy, it created this vacuum. And for the next 60-plus years, a flood of theories and speculation rushed in to try and make sense of what on earth happened on that mountain. Okay, so today, the leading scientific explanation is something called a slab avalanche. Now, this isn't what you might picture, a huge roaring wall of snow. The idea is that a small but very heavy and dense slab of snow slid down onto the tent while they were sleeping. This would explain why they cut their way out in a panic. They thought they were about to be buried. But here's why this theory is so powerful. It could also explain the crushing injuries. The sheer, immense weight of a dense snow slab could cause that kind of internal damage without leaving big wounds on the outside. It's really one of the only theories that explains both the flight and the force. Another natural theory revolves around something called katabatic winds. These are incredibly powerful, sudden gusts of wind that can rush down a mountainside. The idea is that these hurricane-force winds may be combined with low-frequency sound, infrasound, created by the mountain's topography, could have caused a state of intense, irrational panic. This theory is interesting because it helps explain why they would suddenly flee like that, but it doesn't really explain the injuries. Wind, no matter how terrifying, just can't crush a human chest like that.
Of course, this was the height of the Cold War, so a military theory has always been very popular. What if the hikers stumbled onto something they weren't supposed to see, like a secret weapons test? That could maybe explain the reports from other people in the area about strange orange lights in the sky that night, and it might even explain the radioactivity on the clothes. But there's just no hard evidence. No declassified documents have ever surfaced to prove it.
And you know, whenever you have a mystery this deep, speculation is going to run wild. Over the years, people have proposed everything from UFO encounters to attacks by a Russian Yeti. And while those ideas are out there, it is really important to remember that there is absolutely no physical evidence from the scene to support any of them. So after all this time, after all these theories, why does this story still have such a tight grip on our imagination? Why do we keep coming back to Dyatlov's Pass? I think it's because it's just the perfect storm for a mystery. At its heart, it's a real human tragedy about young, relatable people. Then you add these layers of bizarre physical evidence that just seems to contradict itself at every turn. On top of that, you have this vague official conclusion that feels more like a cover-up than an actual answer. And it all happens in this remote, forbidding place that's literally called the Mountain of the Dead. So in the end, we're left with the exact same question that investigators had back in 1959. What compelling force, whether it was natural or something else entirely, was so powerful that it drove 9 experienced, capable hikers from the safety of their tent out into a frozen nightmare and ultimately to their deaths on the Mountain of the Dead?